The day Jasper Wilde planned to propose to Josephine Tate was the day his life was supposed to start. He had the ring. He had the words. He had the girl. Or so he thought, because on that exact day, a woman he'd never seen before walked into the town square. She was tall, nearly 6 feet, with shoulders that could shame an ox, and arms that looked like they could wrestle a bear and win. She moved like she owned the very dust motes dancing in the afternoon sun. And she announced to everyone with an earshot that she was claiming his hand in marriage. Not asking. Claiming. Like he was a prize steer at the county fair. Jasper stood there frozen solid. The delicate silver ring he'd spent weeks crafting for Josephine felt heavy and useless in his palm. This stranger, this giant of a woman, was pointing a calloused finger straight at him. The whole town went quiet. Conversations died in people's throats. Heads turned. Eyes stared. It wasn't her size that made Jasper's blood turn to ice. It wasn't even her impossible, audacious claim. It was the way she said his name. His full name. Jasper Thomas Wilde. A name he hadn't heard in 15 years. A name only his mother, long since passed, had ever used. And then she smiled. It wasn't a mean smile. It was something far more terrifying. It was a smile that said she knew him. Knew things about him he'd buried so deep he'd forgotten they were even there. Important things. Things that explained everything. The ring slipped. It fell from his trembling fingers, hitting the hard-packed dirt with a tiny metallic clink that sounded like a gunshot in the dead silence. She started walking toward him. Slow. Deliberate. And as she closed the distance, Jasper realized the most unsettling part of it all. It wasn't what she was doing, it was what was happening inside of him. A flicker, a deep buried ember stirring in his chest, something that felt dangerously, terrifyingly close to recognition. Just 3 hours earlier, Jasper Wilde had been on top of the world. He'd polished that ring, hammered from his grandfather's silver watch chain, until it shone like a captured star. He'd practiced his proposal in the mirror, smoothing his hair, straightening his vest. "Miss Josephine, would you do me the honor?" The words were perfect. She was perfect. Josephine Tate, the banker's daughter. Petite, gentle, with a laugh like wind chimes. She was his ticket to a quiet life. A predictable life. A safe life. They'd talked about it, in their own shy way, during long walks under her lace parasol. It was all but settled. But now he was on his knees in the dirt, scrambling for a ring that suddenly felt like a lie. The woman stood 10 feet away, watching him. Her eyes were dark, and they seemed to see right through the man he'd built himself into, and straight to the boy he'd tried to forget. "You don't remember me yet," she said. It wasn't a question. "But you will." The townspeople started to melt away. This was too strange, too raw for a quiet afternoon. Mrs. Henderson hustled her kids into the general store. Old Pete, the town drunk, shook his head and shuffled off toward the saloon. Even the pastor, a man who loved a good public spectacle, decided the church needed his immediate attention. Only Josephine remained. She stood by the fountain, a statue in a pristine yellow dress. Her face was as pale as milk. Her blue eyes darted between Jasper and this stranger, wide with confusion and a hurt that twisted Jasper's gut. He felt guilty. He didn't know why, but the guilt was there, heavy and real. "Miss," Jasper said, finding his voice. He stood up, brushing the dust from his trousers. "I believe there's been a terrible misunderstanding. I don't know you." He took a step toward Josephine, a silent plea for her to believe him. "And I certainly haven't made any promises to you." The woman's smile widened. It was a flash of white teeth in a sun-browned face. "Leona Bishop," she said, giving her name as if it should mean something to him. She reached into a leather satchel slung across her chest and pulled out a piece of paper. It was old, yellowed, and folded into a tight square. "Oh, but you have, Jasper Wilde," she said, her voice dropping, becoming intimate and dangerous. "You most certainly have." The paper crackled as she unfolded it. The sound was like dry leaves skittering across a gravestone. Jasper's eyes locked onto the document. The ink was faded, the handwriting childish and clumsy, but it was familiar, disturbingly familiar. His own name was scrawled at the bottom, a boy's signature, and Leona Bishop began to read. Her voice was warm, a strange contrast to her imposing frame. Jasper Thomas Wilde promises to marry Leona Bishop when they grow up. The words hung in the air, impossible and absurd. Signed in blood, she continued, her dark eyes fixed on his. Witnessed by the creek behind the old Miller place, summer of 1854. The Miller place. The name hit Jasper like a punch to the gut. Memories, foggy and dreamlike, swirled at the edges of his mind. A hot summer, the cool rush of creek water, a girl with wild dark hair and scraped knees, a girl who could climb higher and run faster than any of the boys. But that girl was small, scrappy, not this titan of a woman standing before him. That was a game, Jasper stammered, his throat suddenly dry. We were children. You pricked your thumb with your father's hunting knife, Leona said, taking a step closer. The scent of leather and something wild, like sagebrush after a rain, reached him. You said a promise made in blood was sacred, said it couldn't be broken, no matter what. You said you'd rather die than be a man who went back on his word. Behind him, Josephine made a small, wounded sound, a gasp turning into a sob. Jasper turned. Tears were streaming down her pale cheeks. Her delicate frame was trembling. The sight of her pain should have been his anchor. It should have filled him with righteous anger, sent him charging to her defense to cast this madwoman out of their lives. But when he looked back at Leona, he was frozen again, because in her eyes he saw it, pain, an old, deep pain, and a resolve forged in fire. This wasn't a game to her. This was the end of a long, hard road. She had carried this promise like a shield for 15 years. I kept my part of the bargain, she said, her voice quiet but carrying across the square. I waited. After your parents passed and you were sent away, I waited for you to come back. I waited 15 years, Jasper. Her gaze was unwavering. I watched other men come courting. Good men. Men who offered me an easier life. And I turned them all away. Because I had a promise. She carefully folded the yellowed paper and tucked it back into her satchel. Now I'm 23 years old, she said, her voice like steel. And I'm tired of waiting for you to remember what honor means. The finality of her words settled over the square, and in that silence, Jasper felt the carefully constructed walls of his safe, predictable life crumble into dust. The future he had planned so meticulously was gone. Erased in a matter of minutes by a ghost from a past he couldn't even properly remember. He looked down at the ring, half buried in the dirt. A broken promise. When he looked up again, Josephine was gone. Her yellow dress was just a flash of color disappearing around the corner of the mercantile. She hadn't said a word. She didn't need to. Her silent retreat was a verdict. A hot surge of anger, sharp and blinding, washed over Jasper. Now look what you've done, he snarled, turning on Leona. That woman was going to be my wife! Leona didn't flinch. Her expression was calm, almost pitying. No, she said simply. She was going to be your escape. There's a difference. The words were a slap in the face, because they were true. Josephine was safety. Josephine was a quiet harbor from the storms of his childhood, from the loss of his parents, from a world that had proven to be cruel and unpredictable. He'd chosen her not just for her gentleness, but for her predictability. You can't just show up after 15 years, he said, his voice shaking with a rage that was really just fear. You can't just demand a life based on a childhood promise. But he remembered. He remembered the sting of the knife on his thumb. He'd pressed down hard, harder than he needed to. He'd wanted the pain to feel as big as the promise he was making. He'd wanted to be a man of his word, even at 8 years old. Leona stepped closer again. So close he had to tilt his head back to meet her eyes. She filled his vision, solid and real and undeniable as a mountain range. "I didn't come here to destroy your life, Jasper," she said, her voice softening, losing its hard edge. It became something else, something that made the hairs on his arms stand up. "I came here to save it." Before he could even begin to process what that could possibly mean, a new sound cut through the tense quiet. The rhythmic thunder of approaching horses. Fast ones. 3 riders appeared out of the heat haze at the edge of town. Their faces were grim, their hats pulled down low. Jasper knew them instantly. The Morrison brothers. Carl, the eldest, swung down from his horse before it even stopped moving. He walked toward them with the rolling swagger of a man who got paid to be mean. His brothers, Luke and Billy, fanned out behind him, their hands hovering near their pistols. They were hired muscle, guns for rent, and for the last week, they'd been a dark cloud hanging over the town, asking questions about old deeds and forgotten water rights. Carl's eyes landed on Leona, and a slow, ugly smile spread across his face. It was the look of a coyote spotting a lone sheep. "Well, well," Carl drawled, his voice thick with menace. "What do we have here? The big lady who's been poking her nose where it don't belong, asking questions about the old Bishop property." Leona's posture changed. It was a subtle shift, but Jasper saw it. Her shoulders squared. Her weight settled into the balls of her feet. She was like a sleeping wolf that had just opened its eyes, ready. "I wasn't asking questions," she said, her voice perfectly even. "I was making statements about my family's land." Carl let out a short, harsh laugh. "Your family's land? Sweetheart, that land's been tied up for years, and some powerful folks are getting real tired of the knots. They're thinking it's time to just cut the rope." The air grew thick, heavy. Carl took another step toward Leona, his brothers closing in, forming a half circle around them. Jasper's muscles tensed, his fists clenching at his sides. He was about to step forward, to say something, do something, anything. But Leona put a hand on his chest, stopping him. Her palm was warm and firm through the thin fabric of his shirt. There was a surprising strength in that simple touch, a current of energy that shot right through him. "Stay back, Jasper," she said, her eyes never leaving Carl's. "This isn't your fight." Carl's ugly smile widened. "Actually," he drawled, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near her boots, "it might be more his fight than you think. See, we heard your little announcement, claimin' this fella. We're thinking maybe Jasper here needs to understand exactly what kind of trouble he's getting himself tangled up with." He reached out, his grimy hand aiming to grab Leona's arm. He meant to bully her, to show her who was in charge. He made a terrible mistake. What happened next was a blur of motion, too fast to follow. Leona's hand shot out, catching Carl's wrist in midair. There was a sharp twist, a sickening crack of bone and cartilage, and suddenly Carl Morrison, a man twice Jasper's size, was on his knees in the street, his face a mask of shock and agony. "The kind of woman," Leona said, her voice as calm as if she were discussing the weather, "who doesn't appreciate being touched without permission." Luke and Billy went for their guns, but Leona was already moving. She shoved the whimpering Carl away from her and stepped sideways, putting her body between the brothers and Jasper. Her hand dropped to the handle of a large knife sheathed at her belt. The movement was fluid, economical, and utterly terrifying in its casual competence. "Now, gentlemen," she said, and that calm authority was back in her voice. "I suggest you pick up your brother, get on your horses, and ride out of town, before this becomes a conversation that ends badly for all of us." For a long second, nobody moved. The only sound was Carl gasping for breath on the ground. His face was beet red with a mixture of pain and pure humiliation. He looked up at Leona, and Jasper saw something new in his eyes. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was fear. "This ain't over," Carl spat, cradling his broken wrist as he scrambled to his feet. But he was already backing away toward his horse. His bravado was gone, replaced by a sullen, hateful promise. "That land's gonna change hands, Bishop. One way or another. And your new boyfriend here better think long and hard about whose side he's on." The 3 of them mounted up and galloped out of town, leaving a cloud of dust and curses hanging in the air. Jasper just stared at Leona. She stood perfectly still, not even breathing hard. She looked as calm as the summer sky. He watched her hand leave the hilt of her knife, her posture relaxing slightly. The wolf was dormant again, but he knew now that it was always there, right under the surface. "Where did you learn to do that?" he finally managed to ask, his voice barely a whisper. She turned to face him. "Same place I learned that promises matter," she replied, her dark eyes searching his. "From a life that taught me you have to be strong enough to protect what's rightfully yours." She took a step toward him, closing the distance until she was standing where Josephine had been just moments before. But where Josephine was a gentle breeze, Leona was a force of nature. In the fading light, he could see tiny flecks of gold in her dark irises. He saw the strong line of her jaw, the determined set of her mouth. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, laced with a strange vulnerability that seemed at odds with the warrior he'd just seen. "The Morrison brothers aren't wrong about one thing, Jasper," she said quietly. "You're going to have to choose a side, and you're going to have to do it soon." Later that evening, Jasper found himself walking a path he hadn't taken in 15 years. The memories pulled him, ghosts leading him toward the old creek behind the long-abandoned Miller place. The cottonwood trees were bigger now, but the creek still ran cold and clear over smooth stones, and the massive old oak tree still stood guard, its branches reaching out like ancient arms. He saw her from a distance. She was sitting on a fallen log near the water's edge, the very log where they had made their promise. She'd changed out of her dusty traveling clothes and was now wearing a simple brown dress. It made her look less like a warrior and more like a woman, but no less formidable. Her dark hair was undone, hanging loose around her broad shoulders. "I had a feeling you'd end up here," she said without turning around. "You always did your best thinking by the creek." He sat down on the other end of the log. The space between them felt charged, electric. "I'm starting to remember," he admitted, his voice low. "Flashes, pieces. It's like looking through a thick fog. Why did you leave, Leona? Why did your family just disappear?" She picked up a flat stone and sent it skipping across the surface of the water. 1, 2, 3, 4 perfect ripples spread out in the twilight. "My father owed money," she said simply, "to the wrong man. The Bishop land, our land, has the best water rights in this valley, rights that go back 30 years. But a piece of paper doesn't mean much when the other man has more guns and more lawyers." Her voice was flat, devoid of self-pity. "We had to run, left in the middle of the night with nothing but what we could carry on our backs." Another stone skipped across the water. "My parents caught a fever 3 winters later up in Colorado. They didn't make it." She finally turned to look at him, and the pain in her eyes was a raw, open wound. "I've been on my own ever since, working, saving, getting stronger, getting smarter, all for one reason, to come back here and take back what was stolen from us." The pieces clicked into place. "The Morrisons," Jasper said. "They work for the man who took your land." "Samuel Morrison," she confirmed, her voice hardening at the name. "He's their uncle. He bought our property for pennies on the dollar after he ran my father off. Carl and his brothers are just the dogs he uses to keep everyone else away from his bone." A cold dread settled in Jasper's stomach. This was bigger than a forgotten promise. This was a war. "And you think marrying me, you think enforcing our childhood pact, will help you win this war?" Her expression softened again. It was that vulnerability that unsettled him more than her strength. "I think," she said, choosing her words with care, "that a man who keeps his word is a rare and powerful thing. The land is just dirt and water, Jasper. But a man's honor, that's the foundation everything else is built on." She reached across the log and gently touched his hand. Her fingers were rough, calloused from years of hard labor, but her touch was surprisingly gentle. "I didn't come here asking for a white knight. I'm strong enough to fight my own battles. I came here to ask you to remember the boy you used to be. The boy who believed in right and wrong. The boy who knew that safe wasn't the most important thing a man could be." The creek whispered beside them. A mockingbird started its evening song in the branches above. Jasper felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, the life he knew behind him, and a terrifying unknown wilderness ahead. Suddenly, the sound of a single horse approaching shattered the quiet. Leona was on her feet in an instant, her hand on her knife, her body a coiled spring. Jasper stood too, his heart pounding, expecting the return of the Morrisons. But the rider who emerged from the twilight shadows was not a threat they were expecting. It was Josephine Tate. She sat on her father's fine chestnut mare, but she was no longer the wilting flower from the town square. The yellow dress was gone, replaced by a practical dark blue riding habit. Her face, usually so soft, was set in a firm, determined line, and her blue eyes, when they met Jasper's, were not filled with tears, but with a cold, sharp fire he had never seen before. "I thought I might find you two here," she said, and her voice was as crisp and cool as the evening air. "Josephine," Jasper started, his mind scrambling for an explanation, for an apology, for anything. "I can explain." "There's no need," she cut him off, swinging down from her horse with an unexpected grace and confidence. She walked toward them, her boots making soft sounds on the damp earth. Her gaze flicked from Jasper to Leona and back again, measuring them both. "Miss Bishop," she said, her tone formal and icy, "I believe you and I need to have a very serious conversation. About Jasper Wilde." Leona raised an eyebrow, a silent challenge. She didn't move, didn't speak. She just waited. "I have known Jasper for 2 years," Josephine said, her voice ringing with a newfound strength. "In all that time, I have never seen him look at anyone or anything the way he looked at you in the town square today, with that mix of terror and recognition." The admission seemed to pain her, but she didn't falter. "And I realized something. I didn't love Jasper. I loved the idea of him, the safety, the quiet, predictable life he offered." She turned her fiery gaze on Jasper. "But I don't want that life anymore. I want a life with passion, the kind of passion that makes a woman ride 1,000 miles and face down armed men to claim what is hers." Then she turned back to Leona, and a strange, almost predatory smile touched her lips. "But your claim is based on a piece of paper. My claim is based on the full legal and financial power of my father, the most influential man in this territory." Jasper stared, stunned. This was not the Josephine he knew. "My father has already started the legal process to have you declared a vagrant and a fraud, Miss Bishop," Josephine continued, her voice like ice. "Samuel Morrison may own the deed to your land, but my father owns the bank that holds Morrison's loans. We can ruin him, and we can run you out of this territory for good." She stepped closer to Jasper, her eyes pleading now. "It's not too late, Jasper. Forget this madness. Send her away. Marry me, and together we will have everything: power, wealth, a real future. Not this fantasy from the past." Before either Jasper or Leona could respond to the shocking ultimatum, a new sound filled the air. Not one horse, not 3, but a dozen. Maybe more. They were coming fast, crashing through the underbrush. Leona's face went grim. "Samuel Morrison," she breathed. "He's not waiting for the law." Samuel Morrison rode into the clearing at the head of a small army of hired guns. He was an older, more dangerous version of his nephews, with cold, dead eyes and a silver-streaked beard. He dismounted, and his men fanned out, creating a ring of steel around the 3 of them by the creek. "Leona Bishop," he boomed, his voice full of gravel and arrogance. "I heard you were back, stirring up trouble on my land." "This isn't your land, Samuel," Leona shot back, stepping forward. "This is Bishop land." Morrison laughed, a cold, empty sound. "Your father signed it over. I have the papers." "Papers signed under duress!" Josephine snapped, surprising everyone. She stood her ground, facing the armed men. "And my father has the bank records that show you acquired the property through fraudulent means." Samuel's eyes narrowed. He looked from Leona to Josephine, a flicker of uncertainty in his cold gaze. 2 women, both claiming a right to stand against him. One with a blood promise, the other with the power of the bank. He turned his gaze to Jasper. Boy, you've got a choice to make. You can side with this ghost from the past, or you can side with the future, he said, gesturing toward Josephine. But either way, you're in my way. Jasper looked at Leona, at her fierce, unwavering courage. He looked at Josephine, at her desperate, twisted attempt to hold on to the life she thought she wanted. And in that moment, he finally understood. Safety was a cage. Honor, courage, that was freedom. I've already made my choice, Jasper said, his voice clear and steady. He walked over and stood beside Leona. He didn't touch her, but his presence was a declaration. I'm standing with her. Josephine's face crumpled in disbelief and fury. You fool! She screamed. Samuel Morrison smiled. Wrong choice! His hand dropped to his gun. Instantly, a dozen pistols were drawn, all aimed at Jasper and Leona. The clearing was filled with the metallic clicking of hammers being cocked. But just as Morrison was about to give the order, a single, sharp command cut through the air. Hold your fire! Everyone froze. A man stepped out from behind the trees. He was wearing a dusty suit and a bowler hat, and he held a piece of paper in his hand. It was Mr. Tate, Josephine's father, the banker. He looked pale and terrified. Samuel, the banker said, his voice trembling. It's over. A federal marshal arrived on the afternoon train. He's investigating your land claims. All of them. A collective gasp went through the hired guns. This was no longer a local dispute. Samuel Morrison went white. He stared at the banker, then at Leona. You! He snarled. Leona smiled. You thought I came back here with just a single piece of paper and a knife? I sent letters to the territorial governor months ago. I sent copies of your threats to my father. I sent everything. She's lying! Morrison roared, but his men were already wavering. They were hired guns, not fools. They wouldn't stand against a federal marshal. Am I? Leona reached into her satchel. She didn't pull out old letters. She pulled out a thick, leather-bound ledger. My father was a meticulous man. He kept a record of everything. Every threat, every extorted dollar. It's all in here. In a code only 2 people in the world would know. She looked at Jasper. A code we made up as children, playing by this very creek. The final piece of the puzzle slammed into place. The truth, undeniable and absolute. Samuel Morrison's empire of fear collapsed. His men began to back away, holstering their weapons, melting back into the trees. They wanted no part of this. Soon, only Samuel and his nephews remained, looking cornered and desperate. Samuel made one last, desperate move. He lunged, not for his gun, but for Josephine, grabbing her as a shield. But the Josephine who had wilted in the town square was gone forever. She twisted in his grip, brought her heel down hard on his instep, and drove her elbow back into his ribs. He gasped and loosened his hold for just a second. It was all Leona needed. She moved like lightning, closing the distance and disarming him with the same brutal efficiency she had used on his nephew. He was on the ground, disarmed and defeated in seconds. The fight was over. Justice, 15 years delayed, had finally arrived. As the federal marshal and his deputies led the Morrisons away in chains, the clearing by the creek grew quiet once more. Mr. Tate, looking ashamed, led a weeping Josephine away. Jasper and Leona were finally alone. The twilight had deepened into a soft, purple dusk. The stars were beginning to appear. Jasper looked at Leona, truly seeing her for the first time, not as a memory, not as a warrior, but as the woman who had crossed a continent and a decade and a half to keep a promise. The woman who had, in one impossible day, saved him from a life he hadn't even realized was a prison. He reached down and picked up the silver ring from where he'd dropped it in his pocket hours ago. It felt different now. Not a promise of safety, but a promise of adventure, of truth. He got down on one knee, there on the damp earth by the Whispering Creek. Leona Bishop, he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. I am a man who went back on his word, and I will spend the rest of my life making it up to you, if you'll let me. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Her answer wasn't a word. It was the brilliant, beautiful smile that lit up her face. It was the tears that welled in her golden-flecked eyes. It was the way she pulled him to his feet and kissed him, a kiss that tasted of dust and wild sage and promises finally kept. If you enjoyed this story of a promise that could not be broken, click the video on your screen now for another incredible story of love and justice against all odds. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Your support means the world to us.